Hello and welcome to the HR Book Club, the series where we meet the authors behind the very best HR books. Today I'm joined by Lars Schmidt to discuss Redefining HR. Hi Lars, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Lars, so I suppose a good place to start is to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, hi. Well, it's good to be here with you. My name is Lars Schmidt. I'm based outside of Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I've spent a little over 20 years in the kind of recruiting and HR and talent space. Currently, I'm the founder of a company called Amplify that has an agency, an accelerator platform, and a media channel, really all aimed at accelerating innovation in HR. That's kind of my core mission and what led me to the book and the podcast and a lot of the other kind of outlets that I have, shining a spotlight on modern people practices and practitioners.
Cool, excellent. So tell us about Redefining HR then. What's the book about and who's it aimed at?
So the book is about, it's really kind of a roadmap for modern HR and people practices. It was the evolution in a lot of ways. It kind of started as a year-long series I did in Fast Company, where I called 21st Century HR, where I was kind of spotlighting innovative people practices. That led to a podcast where I've interviewed
Okay.
CHROs and CPOs, and then that led to the book. And so really with the book, I've been covering modern HR and people practices for the better part of 8 or so years now. And I wanted to create a kind of cohesive narrative and a look at what modern HR looks like today and how it differs from the legacy counterparts. And so that was really the driver behind the book. And then it was really important to me to bring in tons of case studies and practitioner spotlights and stories from people kind of, in the trenches doing the work. So they could kind of bring that experience of like what it's like to think about DEI in a modern context, what it's like to think about employee experience in a modern context, and really make that real with examples.
Fantastic. So I suppose it links quite nicely to the podcast that you have then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it kind of spawned from the podcast. So I think I'd
Yeah.
had so many interesting conversations in the podcast where I was like, God, podcast is a great medium for that because it's authentic. You hear the voice, it's a story, but
Yeah.
it's not a great resource. It's not a great platform for like going back and looking something up. Like, oh, what did this guest think about this topic? And so the book really allowed me to do that. It allowed me to contextualize and categorize some of the conversations from the podcast, and then more outside of the podcast as well.
Fantastic. So, so am I right in thinking it was the first book that you wrote? I know you've written other stuff.
Second book, so I
Okay.
co-authored Employer Branding for
Oh,
Dummies with
yeah.
Universum's Richard Mosley back in 2017. So different process in writing that kind of a book, but this is my first solo book.
Okay. And how did you find the writing process on a solo basis?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a very different writing experience. For Employer Branding for Dummies, I had a very narrow window to write half the book. So it was basically I cleared my schedules for 6 weeks and just focused on
Yeah.
that. Writing a book in the beginning stages of a once in a generation global pandemic is an interesting exercise. In a lot of ways, it actually helped me because I wrote most of the book while we were in the pandemic. So when it came out in January, it was, I think, the first HR book that accounted for many of our new realities in HR that were driven by the pandemic. So, in that sense, the timing was, fortunate, but yeah, it definitely it allowed me to kind of include things like the shift towards remote. It allowed me to include things like the
Yeah.
change conversations around mental health, change conversations around social justice and racial equity in the workforce following George Floyd's murder in 2020.
Mm.
So, it allowed me to kind of bring so many things that were so front of mind for the field of HR and embed them throughout the book, which was great because so much of maybe what we held as true once in HR is no longer true, and so I'm very grateful that I was able to kind of write a book that was timely for the moment in time that we were in and kind of continue to be in.
Yeah. It's interesting because Perry Timms, who's been on the HR Book Club and also on our Hosting HR podcast, obviously gave your book as the recommendation for him at the moment. So it's obviously very timely as well. Do you have plans to write already plans for another book, or for the moment you're quite happy just focusing on what you're doing?
Yeah, I wouldn't call them plans, thoughts.
Yeah,
There's so much content that I have, especially when it comes to kind of leaning on some of the conversations from the podcast. So
yeah.
there's definitely another book in me. When I don't know, it's not going to be soon. I've got a lot of other kind of projects going on, but yeah, I do envision there will be another book at some point.
Fantastic. So
I can follow Perry's lead there, right? He's
yeah,
a prolific writer, so I will
yeah.
use him as my muse.
Yeah, yeah. No, he's inspired a few other people as well that I've spoken to. So from a HR book perspective, then, if you were to recommend a HR book to somebody, just one, that's
Yep.
not your own, which book would you recommend, Lars?
And I would recommend Perry, but I feel like that would be cheating. So I would recommend Workquake from Steve Cadigan.
Okay.
Steve was the former head of people at LinkedIn. I think one of the first heads of people, experienced HR executive and leader. But Workquake, again, it was one of the few books that came out a little bit earlier this year, but very
Yeah.
focused on kind of the now of HR and the now of business and how the role has evolved. And so, again, I think those types of books at this moment for HR, as we're in these times of pivotal change, are so important. And Steve's great. So I would definitely recommend that book.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Lars, and telling us all about redefining HR. And hopefully, maybe we'll see you another time for something else.
Yeah, well, that sounds great. I appreciate you having me.
Cheers.
Take
Bye.
care.